Hello, welcome to episode 3 of the English Journeys podcast, as we set out on the next leg of our Borderlands journey. As we leave Ledbury, our road runs alongside the main railway line to Hereford, but we soon curve away and you can begin to see rising ground on the left-hand side. The tree-covered summit of this gentle hill is the ancient Iron Age hill fort of Wall Hills, which would have kept watch over the valley of the little river Leaden to the south. It has none of the grandeur of the great British camp to the east of Ledbury, which we explored in episode 1. But it would have been a powerful feature in the landscape nonetheless. There are still the remains of great banks and ditches and a complex hidden entrance, and it's possible that its presence would have been much greater. Certainly its great ramparts would have been higher, grander, more powerful, perhaps even crowned by a wooden palisade. But current archaeological thinking suggests that the great banks of these prehistoric hill forts would have been much more dramatic, stripped of their vegetation to stand out raw and violent against the greens of the surrounding countryside dominating the environment, perhaps whitened with chalk or clay, clad in stone, or, maybe here, cut back to reveal a red wall of Herefordshire soil. And as we travel, keep an eye open for some handsome brick-built traditional farms, the farmhouse surrounded by yard and outbuildings, including hop kilns and great barns. Although many of these buildings date from the later 18th or early 19th centuries, the farms themselves can date back many centuries, with medieval barns tucked in amongst the modern farm buildings. And as you wind through hop fields and orchards sheltered by their high hedges, there is a sense of passing through a landscape which has been essentially unchanged for hundreds of years. 4 miles from Ledbury, we come to the major crossroads at the village of Trumpet, at which we need to turn right to head towards Leominster. The village, was little more than a scattering of houses along the road, is named after the handsome half-timbered inn on the left, its front wall bulging out like a well-kept stomach. And the inn itself was named after the requirement of the postboys on the great lumbering stagecoaches to sound their trumpets as they reached it to alert the inn workers and travellers of their arrival. Because this is an important crossroads on 2 ancient routes. Straight on, the road links the great medieval centres of Hereford and Tewkesbury, while we turn onto a major Roman road, heading off northwest as straight as an arrow for the first few miles. In Roman times it linked the city of Glevum, which is modern Gloucester, with Bravonium, a fairly important town, of which there is no obvious trace today. Its ruins lie buried under the town of Ledbury in the very north of Herefordshire. And then, beyond that, the road travelled on northeast to the city of Victorian or Wroxeter, once the 4th largest city in Britannia, whose walls, markets and bathhouses now stand alone, ruined and abandoned in Shropshire fields. But here, this modern tarmac surface disguises a road that has been used for nearly 2,000 years. We're travelling on the very ground marched on by the Roman legions in their conquest and subjugation of Western Britain. And it has remained an important road for 2 millennia, linking the south and north of these western lands. 200 or 300 years ago it was a main turnpike road, and shortly after the crossroads we pass a little toll house on the right, where the toll man would collect payment from travellers to keep the road in good repair. And as we follow the road, we pass through the hamlet of Stretton Grandison. It's little more than a few houses, farms and barns now picturesque, with cottage gardens and solid half-timbered buildings of the 16th and 17th centuries, and a fine 14th century church. But this little settlement hides an unexpectedly elaborate history. And, as such, it's a place which embodies so much of the cumulative history of England as each century lays down its layer of lives lived over the traces of those who have gone before. And standing in the centre of the village, you can see the road to the church leading off to the right, its steeple rising tall and sharp above the trees. But there is no clue that we're standing in the middle of what was a thriving Roman market town. And where is it now? It wasn't small, it wasn't unimportant. Archaeological excavations have revealed a large Roman cemetery, traces of industry, houses and townspeople safely enclosed within its walls and fortifications. That's almost impossible to imagine now. But today, like so much history in this country, it lies buried, secret, erased by, in this case, a new world of Germanic conquerors and settlers who swept in after the disappearance of the Roman legions. There is no visible evidence, but the name of the village gives a clue. In the Dark Ages, the Saxon word strait was given to Roman roads throughout the country, and it found its way into place names, Streatley, Streatfield, and, of course, Stretton. But in some ways, this is just recent history. Archaeologists have found eel and fish traps and traces of people's occupation of these gently rolling lands dating back to the Neolithic period. There were people here 6,000 years ago, fishing the watercourses, farming, living. Dig down in this country and you can travel back to the distant past to awake the ghosts of other times and other worlds. As we leave the village, the road jinks off to the left, and we depart from the line of the Roman road, but traces of the route can still be seen in field boundaries, hedge lines, farm tracks, footpaths. But we carry on to the Newtown crossroads and go straight on, crossing the historic road linking the medieval cities of Worcester and Hereford. And as we continue, the road straightens towards Burley Gate and Oakle Pitchyard. And just before the roundabout at Burley Gate, you can see a turning on your left to Oliver's Cider. And this is cider country. We pass acres of cider apple and perry-pear orchards on our journey, all bringing their own beauty to the landscape. Modern orchards with their tightly ranked rows of trees colour the country in autumn with the reds and golds and greens of their fruit, in spring with a great froth of delicate blossom. And old orchards with their hoary trees laden with bunches of mistletoe, they bring their own idiosyncratic beauty. There are few trees more characterful, few fruits more various or ancient as cider apples. As well as Oliver's, we pass other cider houses pressing local apples and perry-pears, and the names of these fruits read like a litany of country tradition. These are not the supermarket Granny Smiths, Golden Delicious or Braeburn. These are Breakwell's Seedling, Knotted Kernel, Court Royal, Yarlington Mill, Dabinet, Foxwhelp, Brown Snout, Kingston Black, Stoke Red, Michelin, Merrylegs, Cockagee, and Wilding Bittersweet. The names are a song waiting to be sung, and there are hundreds of varieties. Each county has its own traditions of cultivation and cider making. Every variety has its own idiosyncratic name. Dunkerton Cider, whose orchards we passed close by later on our journey, use more than 30 different varieties of apple in just one of their medium dry recipes. But many of these ancient fruits are now critically endangered. Most are grown in fewer than 10 known sites. So it is clearly our social duty and responsibility to drink as much cider as we possibly can to ensure the survival of this natural heritage. I know I do. At the Burley Gate roundabout, turn left towards Hereford. In 3 miles or so you come to the hamlet of Withington Marsh, and on your way into Withington you pass Thing Hill Lodge, which looks like a little piece of baronial Scotland or a tiny Loire chateau with towers and spires dropped unceremoniously into rural Hereford. and it's all that remains of the palatial Thing Hill mansion. It was the dream house of a wealthy industrialist, Henry Higgins. And like so many successful manufacturers, Henry wanted to build his dream home far from the urban toil of his industrial triumph. And he retired with his fortune from his engineering works in Salford near Manchester in 1871, and he wanted somewhere green, somewhere quiet and unspoilt, where he could look out over his parkland, his woods and gardens, and find peace. And it seems he wanted his own little palace, really nothing like the local country houses of the English Midlands, but his own little Balmoral castle to relive the Scottish fantasy so popular in Queen Victoria's heyday. And no expense was spared. The house was enormous, and the centre of a grand estate including pleasure grounds, kitchen gardens, a landscape park, and stabling for 10 horses. And the interior of the house was luxuriously furnished in the newest fashions, with all the pomp and elaboration that a formal Victorian family could want. But the extraordinary thing is that today there is no sign of it. It's completely disappeared. It's as if Henry's dream had never been. All apart from that one little lodge. But its disappearance isn't an uncommon story. The house was sold on the death of Henry's widow in 1914 to a man called William Abbott, whose only child was killed in action in the First World War. And when William died in 1919 with no heir, the contents of the house were sold, the place was abandoned, and the estate and pleasure grounds cleared. It's a sad tale, but repeated all over the country as the sons and heirs of landowners were slaughtered in the Great War. Lines of succession failed, and society was changing, and the great houses just became liabilities. But this house, curiously, lived on. Nobody in England wanted such an unfashionable monster of a building in the new modern world of the 1920s. But in America it was different. There was still admiration for old and merry England, or a romantic version of it. And the whole house was dismantled, each part, each brick, numbered, packed, and shipped out to Arizona in 1929, where, I don't know, perhaps it still stands. I wonder who bought it. But here in England, Henry Higgins' dream house, his luxurious mansion, didn't even last for 60 years. So, passing through Withington Marsh, you enter Sutton Marsh, and take the first turning on the right after the Cross Keys pub to take the lane towards Sutton St Nicholas and Marden. These are waterlands. You're on a floodplain fed by networks of brooks, streams, pools, and the confluence of the rivers Lug and Arrow as they run down from the western hills to meet just south of the town of Leominster. And as we travel, we cross a small bridge over the stream called the Little Lug, which meanders down to join the River Lug itself in the watermeadows north of Hereford. But we remain dry, because the lane is called Ridgeway, and it does follow a slight ridge, which must have made it an important route in historic times, travelling north from Hereford and providing a sure footing from the danger of the marshes on either side. But perhaps more importantly, it would have provided a safe access into one of the centres of early power in English history, and into one of the cruellest tales of treachery and murder in Anglo Saxon England. As we head north towards the village of Marden, leaving the twin villages of Sutton St Nicholas and Sutton St Michael, you can see rising ground on your right, and this low hill is the great prehistoric enclosure of Sutton Walls. It's green now, its ramparts and earthen banks are tree-covered. But it seems to have been occupied from the late Iron Age until the last days of the Roman occupation, 500 years later. But in the 8th century, in the early Middle Ages, Sutton Walls and the village of Marden to the north was an Anglo Saxon stronghold. It was the site of one of the royal palaces and enclosures of King Offa, the ruler of Mercia, who held sway over the whole of central England, the most powerful and most ruthless man in the country. And it was Offa who built the Great Dyke, a massive ditch and bank of earth, running the whole length of the border between England and Wales, from the Bristol Channel in the south to the River Dee in the north. But why? Why embark on such a massive undertaking? Nobody is entirely sure. To keep the Welsh out? Well, possibly. To stop the rustling of cattle and horses? Well, that seems very likely. But perhaps most importantly, I think he built it simply to demonstrate his strength, to show off his power and authority. Look at me, who can summon 10,000 men to dig and burn and build at my command, and to box you Welshmen in. Be wary of me. And the dyke still remains, and is still a formidable barrier in many places to this day. But we follow the road on to the village of Marden, and then take the little track at the lane's junction, signposted to Marden Church and the banks of the River Lug. Here we are in the rural heart of the county, and we cross the farmyard of Marden Court Farm, past the milking sheds, to arrive at the gates of the churchyard. In the time of Offa, when England as a political idea was just beginning to emerge, the relationship between the various Saxon kingdoms, Mercia, Northumbria, East Anglia, Wessex, was a subtle balance between alliances, marriages, treaties, and military power. And in 794, Offa invited Ethelbert, king of East Anglia, to travel to Sutton to be betrothed to his daughter Alfred. And Ethelbert was highly eligible. Not only was he a king, he was young, handsome, with long golden hair, and was also a very devout Christian. And with this union, Offa knew that Mercia would be invincible. So Ethelbert set out with his entourage, but his departure was met by a host of grim portents of doom, thunder, earthquake, mysterious impenetrable fogs, strange prophecies. But he was determined to carry on. His journey, he felt, was God's will, so who was he to doubt that? But he was in danger. While he travelled west, King Offa's queen, Cynefrith, began to sow fear and suspicion in the king's mind, whispering that Ethelbert was a traitor, was a usurper, and as soon as he was married he would overthrow Offa and take his lands. So by the time Ethelbert arrived in Marden, Offa, rather than looking forward to receiving him as a future son-in-law, saw him as a deadly threat. But he was welcomed into the guest chambers in the manner befitting a young king. But the men of his entourage, his royal bodyguard, were greeted, isolated, stripped, and murdered. And that night Ethelbert was dragged from his bed and beheaded beside the River Lug. Where the body of this holy young man fell, a spring of pure water burst from the ground. Now, as soon as the deed was done, Offa felt terrible remorse. He had killed a holy and innocent man in a most treacherous way. To make amends, Offa arranged to have the body taken to Hereford for proper burial, so it was loaded onto a cart. And on the way, stories of many miracles had been told as the young king's body passed by. But the most famous one took place in the tiny hamlet of Lyde, just outside the town. As the cart hit a bump in the road, Ethelbert's head fell out of its sack, off the cart, and bounced down the track, coming to rest at the feet of a blind beggar, who reached down to touch what it was that had knocked into him. And feeling the long hair and touching the soft eye sockets, the beggar realized that it was a human head, and he held his hands, covered in the royal blood, to his face in horror. And as the blood smeared his face, he was cured, his sight restored. Ethelbert was canonized, and Hereford Cathedral remains dedicated jointly to St. Ethelbert and the Virgin Mary. And the spring which had appeared when he was killed became known as a precious healing well. But Offa was racked with guilt, so much so that he sent an emissary to the Pope to ask how he could make amends for such a dreadful sin. And Pope Adrian told him that he must build a church on the precise spot where Ethelbert was killed and where the healing well had burst forth. And the church in Marden still stands on the bank of the River Lug. And the church itself is usually open, spacious and peaceful. And it's a gentle place now. You can visit it, and if you stand in the beautiful early 14th century chancel, you're touching history, you're connected to legend and tradition. I mean, are you really standing on the spot where that young king was struck down? St. Ethelbert's well certainly still remains there, although it is often dry now. We don't know exactly where Offa's palace stood. Archaeological evidence has been hindered by mistreatment of this important place over the years. It's been used for all sorts of things, for gravel extraction, even as a corporation dump. Humiliating treatment for such an important site. But the banks, ditches and entrances largely survive. And 70 years ago, one of Britain's leading archaeologists, Dame Catherine Kenyon, carried out a major excavation at Sutton. Her most sensational discovery was a pit below the ramparts, where she found the bodies of 24 people. They were all healthy young men who had been viciously slaughtered. They all bore evidence of wounds and violent death. Some had been beheaded. But there was nothing found with them. There was no evidence of any clothing or objects. So it seems as if they had been stripped and executed. And Kenyon's assumption at the time was that these young men had been defenders of the Celtic settlement, who were killed during Roman attacks in the 1st century. But new analysis of the archaeological evidence suggests that the pit was dug long after the Romans had left, perhaps in the 8th or 9th centuries. So could they be the bodies of Ethelbert's bodyguard, so brutally murdered by Offa? Well, pondering all this, we return to our journey, leaving Anglo Saxon bloodshed and treachery behind, to retrace our steps past the cowsheds and turn left to set out to the village of Borderland. English Journeys is directed, produced and engineered by Michael Ellis. It's written and spoken by me, Martin Ellis, and we look forward to being with you again in the next episode.